And we can start with the questions. Is there anything the panel wants to say yes, Susan?
So I did want to say a few things. So.
Great.
I figure if I'm up here on a panel, I'll at least make a few comments, a few reactions. My first reaction is that these are my opinions at this point. I've been at the FDA for all of 2 months, and so I'm starting to learn and observe, but these are not, by no means any official government positions. But one thing I have learned, I've been there for 2 months. I've been in the academic world for 27 years, so it's really interesting to watch the process. And what I have learned is that FDA uses a really careful, thorough, and deliberative process to assure that we have a safe and healthy food supply. And I think you got a sense from listening to Dr. Soda's presentation, the level of rigor, the level of evidence, the level of attention to detail that is used in the government setting is really remarkable. And I've observed that, and I think that's a really important comment. Dr. Dwyer mentioned we do have guidelines on our website, and one of the things that I did in the academic world is I used to frequently go to the FDA website, and now I go to it even more frequently. And there's a lot of information on there, and I'd really encourage you to go to the website and look at it. And in the table one in your handout, there's some guidelines that we put out. Dr. Dwyer mentioned they're good for academic researchers, they're good for people who are involved in policy and regulatory work. Look at the website, there's some really great information on our website. We use all this scientific data in a lot of different ways. We use observational epidemiologic studies. We take into account totality of the evidence. We look at randomized controlled trials. We look at all of the evidence. And in speaking with some of the people in our Office of Nutrition Labeling and Dietary Supplements, oftentimes studies get discounted because of really simple things. And one of the most common things that they have to discount studies for is simply not having adequate control groups. So things that we all learn in basic study design, oftentimes we get science coming in that we can't accept because it's really lacking in really key areas. And I'll come back to this point at the end. We encourage people to dialogue with us. If you are interested in particular aspects, we are open. We're happy to consult with people about specific issues, study design issues, et cetera. So that's a message I'd like to get out. In terms of our process, I knew a little about the process, but not as much as I've learned now. Essentially, with every type of action we take, for example, on the PHO situation, we put out a proposal that says this is what we are thinking. And then there's a mandatory comment period where we get information. We actually pose questions. And we say we want to hear from people about A, B, C, D, E, F, and G in this mandatory comment period. And then we ask for all of this information to come back to us before we then move forward with any type of an action. And in that action, we have to detail our responses to the comments that come in. So it's a truly, really open, transparent, careful, deliberative process that we have to go through before we take any type of a particular action. So with regard to the PHOs, that's one of the things we talked about today, omega-3s, many other lipid-related areas. What FDA essentially did, and this occurred before my arrival, of course, so I'm just reporting back on anything that's been done before, is basically FDA scientists made a preliminary determination that partially hydrogenated oils are not generally regarded as safe. And that is for use in food. And what GRAS standards say is generally regarded by most scientists as being safe. And based upon the science that we've heard about, FDA said we cannot make that conclusion that these are generally regarded as safe. And therefore, they suggested we should revoke the GRAS status for these partially hydrogenated oils. And based upon estimates, we have economists and we have modelers and people working with us as we reviewed all of this data. They suggested that this particular action could potentially save 20,000 heart attacks and 7,000 deaths per year could be prevented by taking this particular action with regard to partially hydrogenated oils. And while intakes have come down with PHOs, remember, like the numbers you saw today, those are average intakes. And we still have people at the 90th percentile of our population that are consuming levels that I think all would agree are not safe. And so where we are is essentially making a preliminary determination. We've elicited public comments and we're reviewing those comments now. One comment I will make is revoking a GRAS status does not preclude a food additive petition. So if someone comes to the FDA and says, we have a specific use that we think is extremely low level, that there is no risk, FDA scientists can review that as a food additive petition. So that is something that people should at least be aware of. So my last comment is that, again, we are open to getting dialogue with people from the outside. We encourage pre-submission consultations for things like health claims. And these are some of the quick observations I've had just in the 2 months that I've been there. And I can say, you know, we've heard a lot about nutrition and toxicology and biostatistics. What's been fascinating to me is to observe the interaction that the nutritional scientists are working with the toxicologists in the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. We're working with our statisticians. We're working with the economists. It's a very multidisciplinary approach to all of these problems. So those are just some very quick reactions from what I've observed from the regulatory environment. So it's been a real privilege to move from an academic into a regulatory environment.
Great. Thank you very much. We've got some questions here, and I'll start off with that and ask a question, then turn to the, oh, you've got one down there. Okay. Could we have the lights up? Is that possible? We all feel like we're getting mug shots taken up here because the lights are glaring. Go ahead. One question.
All right, thank you.
Make
Very
it
nice.
quick. If the questions are more than about 30
No,
seconds. I'm
I
gonna
have
cut
two
you off.
questions. I'm Talvinder with the USDA.
You can only have one.
Research. One to the inflammatory biomarkers. Are they basically in the overabuse or lifetime abuse of sugar, high calories, fat? And the second is for Dr. Montaigne. Do we have a data of inflammatory biomarkers in healthy non-diabetic soldiers after Vietnam and before 9/11 period?
Thank you.
Scott, you want to go first?
Scott, go first. You're in the military. You're always ready.
The answer, would there be data available? If I heard the question correctly, is there data available about an inflammatory biomarker sort of panel on people who are healthy or presumed healthy before 9/11 and after, correct? The answer is probably yes. I don't know. I don't know if anyone's actually looked at that question yet, though. So I can't say how large that data set would be. But I know that, like, I can speak to our organization. We have data from that time period where we've looked at certain biomarkers. I don't know how robust it would be in terms of the diversity that we'd have. It might be that we're things that Kevin was talking about. We might have CRP, you know, but you really would like a little broader panel. But I think there's probably data available.
Thank you. I'm sorry.
Maybe.
We had two questions. Let's go on to the next question.
I'm not sure how I can answer his question, so I didn't really understand it.
Very good. Okay.
Sorry.
Thank you. We want to get as many people involved as possible. The next one is a good question. It really, anyone on the panel or all can answer this one. If you could pick only one most critical research question regarding the effect of dietary lipids on human health, what would it be? Dead silence. Even from the FDA, this is pretty good. This is pretty good. Okay, we'll hear about it later. Dr. Pasota, thanks for covering the NFL, National Football League, no, NEL. The process sounds good, yet the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee report staffed only 27% or less of the third of its research questions were answered by the national or the NEL. So the question is, you also reviewed other systematic reviews, but did these reviews follow your NEL process, and if so, where in the public record is that documented?
So this is a question. that has come up a few times in regards to the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee work. And the committee did use other sources of evidence, as I mentioned. And for a federal advisory committee, we don't tell them what to do. They decide what is their best source of evidence. So when they used existing systematic reviews or other high-quality reports from IOM or WHO, or the one that I mentioned, the AHA-ACC report, they didn't necessarily always follow a NEL process, but the committee decided on these other high-quality reports. And so, there's limited resources to do all the original NEL reviews, but it was really up to the committee to decide what source of evidence that they used to answer their questions. And all of that is publicly available on dietaryguidelines.gov is the full report, along with extensive. I think there's over 1,000 pages in total in regards to their advisory report and supplemental materials that document all their sources of evidence that they use to answer their questions.
Thank you. One additional question. We've talked about a lot of different kinds of research. There are also many different systems used in the federal government. For example, the Agency for Health Quality Health, AHRQ, and many others. Dr. Maney mentioned one that's used FDA. Is there any likelihood that the different systems will be more combined into a sort of a common system? I know the Office of Dietary Supplements has sponsored a number of reviews of the issues that are unique to dietary supplements and to nutrition in the ARC series, and wondered about that. How do you people in government all get together with your different methods?
So I can speak from the NELS perspective. There are interagency groups that get together from the various government agencies to discuss these issues and how systematic reviews are done and across the board. They follow very similar processes. As I mentioned, ARC informed the NEL process, but their process was really specific to certain types of studies, but also certain different research questions in the food and nutrition world, really getting at healthcare. So there is definitely collaboration across the agencies, and as I mentioned earlier, we're having a systematic review roundtable later this year at USDA so that we can really bring all these players into one place to discuss our methodology.
Great. And will you also discuss methodological issues within systematic reviews? For instance, what if you pitched out Japan? What would the answers still be the same and so
Yes.
forth? Good,
Yep.
great. Any questions out here from the floor? We've got a lot here, so it's, yeah, Susan?
Can I just follow up on that response? So I worked on a couple of the DRI panels, and we made extensive use of the systematic review process, including using ARC. So ARC has done some of the nutrition-related systematic reviews. They were incredibly helpful. I know Mei Chung is here in the audience. I heard her ask a question earlier. It's so important to have a transparent process, because as people then would ask us, what was your scientific basis for this decision, we laid out all the tables and all the information, and it's all right there. And one of the things you will see sometimes is when you look in the peer-reviewed literature on systematic reviews on the exact same topic, there can be a diversity of studies that are included or disallowed based upon individual judgments. So one of the beauties of the ARC process is that there are people who are not actually, don't have a stake in the game, who are making those decisions based upon the science and not based upon whether or not they like a particular study or not. So it was really valuable in the vitamin D calcium process, having those ARC systematic reviews. And those are nutrient-based in contrast to the ones that Dr. Soda talked about, which are more foods and dietary patterns.
It's my understanding that, maybe I'm wrong, but I think they're updating the omega-3 one, aren't they? Do you know?
I don't know.
I think yes, but I'm not sure.
Yeah. The vitamin D one was updated.
No, yeah,
Yeah,
I
but
think
I don't know
now
about
they're
the
thinking
omega-3.
about updating others. Well, we'll find out later, or I'll be fired for one or the other. Several investigators wrote of the omega-3, omega-6 ratio. And this question is, no one today discussed this. Is it of value? Should we consider how our studies perturb that ratio? You mavens on the omega-3s, omega-6s?
I'll start, and Scott can help out at the end. My particular perspective is that the omega-6, omega-3 ratio is useless. Not to put too fine a point on it, that the...
It's nice and unambiguous. It's sort
Yeah, I
of
don't
like
want to be
mortality.
ambiguous. I don't think it adds any more information than just the long-chain omega-3 levels themselves. In fact, I was interested in your study. I would bet that if you hadn't changed the omega-6 intake, you would still have had a drop in your omega-6 HUFA, because as the omega-3 HUFAs go up in the blood, the omega-6 HUFAs go down. And so most evidence that I'm aware of say if you lower linoleic acid, you don't lower arachidonic tissue levels. So it's, I don't think it's a valuable marker.
Scott?
I have a couple of things. So when Bill finished, he said something about the arachidonic acid. For those who are interested in that question, go to the presentation on Tuesday.
Teaser.
A teaser.
Is that a commercial?
I just don't feel as though I'm the person that should answer that question. I will say that some of the folks that we've been working with our work would agree with Bill in the regards that the N6, N3, as the variable to be looking at is not probably the right one.
Thank you. Anybody else? Dean, you want to weigh in on it? Okay, great.
Can I just comment on that?
Absolutely.
The other issue is if you're thinking about, this is not an FDA answer, this is from an academic scientist who used to do work on that, is what are you including in the omega-3, you know, and there's no standard. I mean, some people are including alpha-linolenic acid, some people are including EPA and DHA, some people include DPA. It's all over the place. And so if we're going to try to do research on things like omega-3 to omega-6, I think we at least have to agree on what terminology we want to use. If we're using biomarkers, at least you can say which ones you're measuring in your RBC fatty acid profiles. But then again, which of the omega-6 are you going to include? And are they necessarily correlated with diet or not? So it's a tough question because we're not all talking about the same exposures.
Thanks, Susan. That's very helpful. Kevin, here's a question for you. Given current status of science around inflammatory biomarkers, should these biomarkers be included as substantiation in major public health guidelines?
I think it's a great question. I hope from my presentation you got the sense that I think inflammation biomarkers have a lot of promise, but I don't think that we're ready to make important guideline or policy decisions around biomarkers. I just don't think the data sets are adequate yet, and I guess I would encourage the continued expansion of collecting more data with a variety of inflammatory biomarkers, and hope that in the next decade or so that we'll be in a much stronger position to be able to actually start applying those. I certainly am hopeful that they will be something that will be beneficial and will be predictive of health and or disease risk, but I don't think we're there yet.
Thank you. The next question is, I think for Scott, but maybe for some of the rest of you too. Is there any concern about overdosing omega-3 fatty acids in soldiers, and what's the bioavailability of the omegas in eggs and meat?
Is there a concern? Yeah, we would always be concerned. We were not, in our studies, not trying to drive anything to any high levels. We were just trying to put things more into balance if we weren't eating so much soy. And we were eating animal products that were coming more from range-fed animals. So we were not trying to go even out into that range. You notice that the intakes were only a gram. So it's something you could achieve if you ate fish twice a week. We were not using, the supplement we were using was also not very heavily fortified, so we were not going into the multiple gram range.
Yeah, I think the most recent report I've heard from the Norwegian group, they looked at that safety question, and they said up to about 5 grams a day of EPA and DHA is no evidence for any adverse effects. So that's well beyond the range of almost anybody.
Thank you.
Audience question?
The next, is there one in the, oh, please, Dr. Jeffrey from University of Illinois.
My question is for Fritchie.
And when you talked to us about inflammation and resolution, you gave the classic diagram that shows acute inflammation and acute resolution. During a lot of the rest of your talk, you were talking about chronic inflammation, which is what really concerns us with aging diseases. What happens with resolution cytokines in chronic inflammation? Are they chronically elevated, or do we know this, and how do we measure this?
Great question. I don't know. I can't answer your question with science or with evidence. I think it's a very good question, and it's one that needs to be sorted out in the research studies. People are just beginning to ask the right question, and I think your question is among one of the right questions so that we can start collecting the data. Some of the anti-inflammatory cytokines, like interleukin-1 receptor antagonists and IL-10, are frequently measured in multiplexing panels, and we know something about some of those. We're not paying as much attention to them as some of the big players, but I think that if we could mine the data that exists and look for signatures of whether or not people who are suffering from chronic inflammatory conditions, is there some kind of a error or problem in their pro-resolving circuitry or signaling. And I just don't think that we've really looked at the literature and the evidence in that manner. But I think it's a great question, though. Thanks for asking it.
The interesting thing is that, you know, many of these questions start off as very basic research and then they merge right into regulatory, and this is perhaps one of them that shows that we need good scientists all the way across the spectrum. Back here.
Yep. Matt Piccolo, USDA.
And then forward.
In the initial presentation, you mentioned how intermediate outcomes are also used for trying to address impact of diet and the like. At what point do those intermediary outcomes become reevaluated? For example, with LDL, it's maybe not just LDL, but the type of LDL. So at what point does that get looked at again and used to reassess those initial studies that are being used as background data?
Thank you. Anybody have an answer? Deanne.
Well, I think that's a good question. I think there's some accepted biomarkers, and I think if we go to Kevin's talk, which we're talking about, how do you accept new biomarkers? And it gets to that question, which there have been some, there's been quite a discussion about, but I don't think we have a good model for accepting, you know, new biomarkers and what constitutes a biomarker and when is it validated. We only have a few biomarkers. So from a regulatory, I mean, we'd have to ask the regulatory and policy groups about when are those assessed, but one of the differences we see across studies is that a number of studies might be looking at markers or endpoints that are not traditionally, you know, or not accepted as a biomarker. So can you use that for regulatory or policy decision making, or certainly regulatory? That's a question a researcher should ask depending on what the destination is of the science. And there have, you know, I can refer to, I think Kevin mentioned in your talk or you looked at the IOM report on biomarkers. And so it is an active discussion, and it's a challenge right now of what constitutes a biomarker that's going to be accepted for decision making. And I think there's differences in different groups.
There are two IOM reports I think most people in the audience know, but both on this question. I think they were commissioned by FDA, so they're worth reading if you're interested in regulatory. We have the former director of the CIFSAN here
No,
asking
not
a question.
CIFSAN, nutrition and dietary
Oh, I always
supplements.
get it wrong. I'm sorry.
You always promote
Well, she
me,
used to be the
Joanne.
dean of Davis, so.
Right, but now I'm at USAID. So actually, two comments. I really appreciate Dr. Mann's input. And the way I characterize it, because often I would get comments, the science is there, why doesn't FDA move forward with something? And getting that recognition that the science is necessary, but it's not sufficient. that for something to move forward on a policy and a regulatory perspective, it takes building the political will, which includes an economic analysis, a legal analysis, stakeholder input, just a variety of things that have to ultimately drive it forward. I compare, if you look at what happened with nutrition labeling in 1990, it went very quickly because that political will was there. When I went to the agency in 2004, it was the hope of updating nutrition facts, which we're still waiting for. So it's a different process, but it's getting that political will. And the other comment that I wanted to make, which I think you alluded to, the other way for scientists to have input is through the comment process. And oftentimes, I mean, industry is very well organized. They pay attention to the Federal Register. They comment. Many of the NGO groups pay attention to the Federal Register. But individual scientists who have an expertise, who know the evidence, who understand the scientific underpinnings of a policy decision, those comments become very valuable in the process. And it's one of the ways that I think organizations like ASN can be effective, other scientifically based organizations, to really bring that science together to point out why a policy decision is right or on the wrong track. But it's such a critical part, and I always encourage my academic colleagues to do that. I know the Federal Register is not popular reading, but that's where you got to look.
It's better than sleeping pills.
Yeah, exactly.
So let me react
Yes,
to that.
please, just keep it short.
Thank you, Dr. Schneeman. I completely agree with everything you just said. You know, I didn't realize the value of the comment process myself when I was on the outside as an academic. And just to learn the process, I've actually been looking at the comments on some of the, things that are pending. In some cases, we have far too many comments. For example, recently on some of the tobacco work, on the deeming rule, we had 135,000 comments come in. So it's a big job, but they're summarized into buckets of the key issues. And in the setting of the nutrition, I've actually looked at some of the comments that have come in, and I was rather surprised. I just didn't realize that many of my friends and academic colleagues had commented on some of the things that FDA had put forth as a preliminary determination, people I know and respect. And I just wasn't really aware of that opportunity, and it is important. It's very important to get the comments of people who are knowledgeable and know the work, because everybody who has a stake in the game is going to be commenting. So I think that's important. And the second thing is the political will. Yes, we will do everything we can to do our mission of assuring a safe and healthy food supply. But there are forces that make that challenging, as I'm sure you've all observed through the dietary guidelines process that's been unfolding recently. So it's, we're working very hard to carry out our mission, and I'll continue to do that.
So
Tricia, you want to say something?
So to follow up on that, Susan and I were speaking earlier about the public comment period and how vital it is to the work that we do. And the Dietary Guidelines Advisory Committee comment period for all of you has been extended, and it's going to be open through May. So I really encourage all of you to go and submit public comments, because they are considered very carefully along with the advisory report. And so I encourage you to take a look at that database, and that's also available on dietaryguidelines.gov.
Thanks very much, Tricia. The next question is an interesting one. It's for those of us who do basic research with foods or with well-defined extracts to identify mechanisms of action. How do we, sounds familiar, how do we get funding since NIH funding's and how do we get funding specifically for pharmaceutical models? And then how do we publish our research results, since reviewers want to know what the single bioactive is that's responsible for the, it's when there's several bioactives that are involved. Deanne, can you help on that? You tax people.
How you get funding?
No, not on that. I'm more on the science. I think
On the science
how you
side,
get
yeah.
funding, tin cup
yeah.
is the answer.
I
there.
know, I was going to say. And I'm trying to grasp the question, but in terms of looking at mechanisms related to food and, you know, I have to say, I have a frustration about the publication process in the sense that it sometimes seems, and maybe there's editors out here who can comment on this, it sometimes seems that we want more of the new findings. But when you take something and you're saying in a real life setting, you know, does this really work in a real life setting? And I was actually, Dr. Montaigne work about, you know, the ad lib eating setting. I mean, that kind of work, I think, is hard to get funded or hard to get published sometimes, because then you're publishing something that, well, we all knew it should work, but there really is a difference between it really does work in a real life setting and it works in an experimental setting. And I think we need to recognize that difference and give value to the studies that actually then take something and apply it in that real life setting, because there's, you know, you're often looking for the new biggest thing and we still don't know how to apply the current science that we have, and I think there's a huge gap there. I don't know if you wanted to comment on that.
Anybody else want to comment? Okay, Jay.
Yeah, so that was my question. And the point of it is we're at ASN deals with nutrition, and we deal with foods, and people eat foods. And when you try to do research with foods and food products, particularly basic research, to try and explain the mechanisms, because everyone wants you to explain the mechanisms, there's resistance within the system to go in that direction, even though everyone wants that. And I'm trying to figure out how you go about doing that. How do you get funding for it? And then when you actually do it and you submit it for review, the reviewers come back because they look at the reductionist model. You have to reduce everything down to the single bioactive to explain what's going on, when in fact it could be synergistic actions of many things, like what Kevin was talking about in terms of olive oil, the fatty acids as well.
It's a good question. Does anybody want to comment more on that?
Yeah.
Nope. Okay, let's go on to the next one, which is from far across the sea, from Ireland. Can the panel comment on the genetic or phenotypic variation in terms of defining nutrition recommendations? And this is something, as we all know, John Milner always asked at any symposium, and he was the moderator of this symposium for 19 years, and we greatly regret his passing. So this is a good question from Helen Roche at UCD.
Well, I guess because I sat on DRI panels, I can try to address that one. You'd have to have the scientific basis to really know that. And, we know that there are nutrient-gene interactions, but we also know there's a lot of redundancies in the system. And somebody may have one particular polymorphism for a gene in the folate cycle, but they may have a whole host of other polymorphisms for other genes that are in the same cycle. So the science has to guide that policy. So we struggled with it and said it'd be wonderful if we could set nutrient requirements based upon individual genetics, but the science didn't allow us to do that with the understanding that we have today. It's tough, so we end up with population recommendations based upon general healthy populations. There are a few exceptions where sometimes you might set different recommendations for different segments of the population, and the one I recall was, I think it was regard with the vitamin C, that there was a specific comment made for smokers and may require somewhat higher intakes from foods. But other than that, I'm unaware of specific ones where we've taken individual accounts like that with genetics or anything like that, because the science wasn't there to do that.
Anybody else? The next one is an interesting one. It's about systematic reviews and meta-analyses. The question is, with such a trend toward using these to direct policy, can you discuss any limitations associated with this type of data interpretation? Anybody have any comments on that? Certainly, just my own reading of these is that they vary in quality almost as much as any of the things we've talked about, and just because somebody's doing a meta-analysis doesn't mean it's good.
I'll just say, in terms of looking at some of the trans fat literature and the different reviews, the inclusion-exclusion criteria is key. And it's almost like the reviews are almost like clinical trials, where everyone can vary depending on the initial question in the inclusion and exclusion criteria, and then you establish from that it may be a very different review, and yet at the end of the day, the conclusions are sometimes looked at like they're the same, they reviewed the same thing, when in fact they didn't. So I think, we really have to, we somehow have conclusions summarized in one sentences or that 2-second soundbite, and we don't put them into context a lot of times with systematic reviews and meta-analyses. So I think they can be really important tools, but you have to understand the initial question and the initial criteria that were used, because that really directs each answer,
Any other comments on that?
Yeah, I'll comment. We use these again on the DRI process extensively, and for me, I thought getting the independent amalgamation of the research in one place was incredibly helpful. But having said that, the individual panels would look at each individual study in great detail. If it was a key study or a key topic that we're going to be looking at, it was the collection of. But then, I was looking at individual papers as carefully as I could. But getting that amalgamation in an independent way, that these are the studies that meet our criteria, and then turn it over to the scientists to look at the quality and look at the interpretation, I think that's important. I wouldn't want people who are not familiar with nutritional sciences, not familiar with the topic, making clear policy judgments on the basis of a systematic review. I like the idea that it's a compilation of the evidence that you then turn over to the experts to really look into great detail at the individual studies.
Do you agree that, do all of you or some of you agree that it would be helpful for many of us to take a formal course in systematic review procedures and meta-analysis if we're using these in our reading?
I recommended that. I was chair of chronic disease epidemiology at Yale, and we made it a required course for all of our PhD students maybe 5 years ago, because we said this is the way science is moving. Our students need to know first how to do a systematic review, and then how to interpret meta-analyses. We heard some discussion today about evidence of publication bias. I think that's an important tool that future scientists need to have, so we made it a requirement.
Even before Harvard? It's amazing. Yale does do some things right. Tricia and then Scott.
I'm sure I'm a little biased, but I would agree that I think that is where especially our evidence-based policy decisions and dietary guidelines are moving. So it is important that as nutrition scientists, we understand that methodology. But one other important issues about systematic reviews were brought up, but I would also like to highlight that, at least from the USDA and HHS perspective with dietary guidelines, the systematic reviews aren't the only source of evidence that these policies are being based on. The dietary guidelines specifically include a lot of data analyses, food pattern modeling, so there are a lot of rigorous sources of evidence that are put together with systematic reviews, since, as you mentioned, there are some challenges, but collectively all those sources of evidence can really inform the strongest policy.
Thank you. I have another zinger here. Again, it's from Ireland,
follow up on
of
that
course.
first?
This is to Bill Harris. Thank you for an excellent talk. I won't say the name, but I know you know who it is. Do your findings on the wide range of confounding factors have wider implications in nutritional epidemiology in choosing risk factors to control? But you can answer, anybody can answer.
Yes.
You don't have to. Yes.
Next question.
Anyone else? Susan, come on.
Yeah, that is critical. It's absolutely critical, the whole issue of confounding, and that's why we often need, randomized controlled trials and that type of evidence. Even within RCTs, there's fascinating literature on things like people who are adherent, and how do you interpret data from people who are adherent. So one of our tendencies in nutrition is to say, well, let's take everybody who took 80% of their pills and we'll consider them one group. Well, if you look at people who take 80% of their placebos, they do much better than people who don't. So simply being adherent to taking pills predicts better health outcomes, and there's a robust literature on that. So we have to be very careful about the confounding that can come in both in observational studies and in clinical trials when you look at adherence as an indicator of higher, they took more of their nutrients. Well, you find the same thing with placebo as well.
And we think we can get away with, in our discussion, in the limitations section, saying there may be unmeasured confounders, and just move right along. And like we've handled the problem. by just saying that, but we really got to dig deep. I think one of the original slides, I'm not sure which of you had it, saying you really need to know patient characteristics in great detail. And there's lots of things. Just knowing if people have insurance. Are they married or not? I mean, those are things that don't often get used as covariates, but it's important.
Thank you. This has been such a great panel. You people all deserve a big hand, but so does the audience for excellent, excellent questions. And let me just say, we've got about 6 or 8 questions left here. I think the speakers, if you run up quickly, will answer them, but there'll be a publication out of this, and I'm sure that the writing group, which is everybody here, will be taking these questions into account. We'll take them all, and if you have any more, come and see us, and we'll put them down. Thank you so much for a wonderful, stimulating session, and Kristen and Barb Lyle and Courtney have also been key in making this a wonderful, stimulating intellectual exercise of acrobatics across the different fields. Thank you so much, and have a good afternoon.